from Indiana said, for our children and our grandchildren. So without question, the time has come. This is my opportunity to cast a vote, the most important vote that I will have cast in 9 years. Could I ask the gentleman for an additional 30 seconds?
I'm happy to yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from
Gentleman's recognized.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. You know, an opportunity like this just seldom comes. And as I say, it's been 16 years since we have had this opportunity. Don't pass on this. Let's make sure that we have to do it in a bipartisan way because it takes a 2/3 vote. And I disagree with the naysayers that say, well, this has no chance of passing. God help us if this has no chance of passing. This is the one thing that we can do for this country to get us back on the right track and finally prove to the American people that we do have the discipline to protect their money and protect our children and our grandchildren. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
I'll continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New York continues to reserve. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, who is the chairman of the Conservation, Energy, and Forestry Subcommittee, my subcommittee, on the House Agriculture Committee.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. It's no secret, Mr. Speaker, Washington has a spending addiction. Congress has demonstrated that regardless of which party is in charge, the out-of-control spending just does not stop. Each Congress, spending and budget reforms are enacted only to be revised or ignored by the next. Unfortunate as it is, this body has reliably circumvented any real budget process, even its own rules, in order to fulfill its spending addiction. Routine abuses and budget gimmicks, such as emergency designations, are designed to skirt budget enforcement roles and disguise the real level of spending. Similar to rampant drug abuse in the 1980s that led to addiction and violence at epidemic levels, our spending habits have led to a debt crisis that borders on an overdose. Our country needs urgent help, Mr. Speaker, and it's time for intervention. That's why we're here today to consider H.J.Res 2, a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Most importantly, the balanced budget amendment will discourage Congress from circumventing its fiscal responsibilities because a constitutional amendment cannot be revised or ignored. This measure is the only way to force the hand of Congress towards fiscal responsibility by ensuring the policymakers just say no to reckless spending. Many economists and experts agree adoption of such an amendment will begin to address this nation's looming debt crisis and lay a stronger path to long-term economic growth. The American people overwhelmingly back the balanced budget amendment. That's exactly why H.J.Res 2 already has the strong support of a majority of my fellow representatives, including 242 bipartisan co-sponsors. Our constituents understand what it means to live within their means, and they expect nothing less from the federal government. No more denial, Mr. Speaker. It's time for this body to come clean. It's time for each member to decide whether or not this country will continue down a reckless path of debt and despair or quit living beyond our means cold turkey. It's time to rid this chamber of its reckless spending addiction. It's time for Congress to just say no by voting yes on H.J.Res 2. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from New York.
I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes. California, apologize.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.J.Res 2, the Republican plan to amend the Constitution to reduce government investments and codify economic stagnation. We can all agree that it's important to get the federal deficit under control. However, the amendment Republicans are proposing is absolutely the wrong way to do it. It should all be very familiar to anyone who has experienced California's budget problems or even observed them from afar. It should be familiar because, just like in California, this legislation would require that a supermajority of both the House of Representatives and the Senate agree to any bill which raises federal revenues. This not only means potential tax increases, but also any bill that allows tax cuts to expire. In effect, the Republican majority is insisting that the only way the federal government can tackle its deficit is by reducing programs like Pell Grants, unemployment benefits, and infrastructure projects like federal highways. These are the very programs that help people keep their head above water during tough economic time or help them achieve the American dream. And time again, the American people have said that cutting these programs is unacceptable. I agree that we should look at ways to cut waste. However, it's foolish to insist on severe cuts to vital programs which help people during an economic downturn. Furthermore, the California experience has shown that it is practically impossible for 60% of a political body to agree on revenue increases, no matter how limited they are or how much sense they might make. California has tried this flawed plan, and guess what? It doesn't work. California's fiscal situation becomes increasingly difficult each year because of this supermajority requirement. Do we really want the same at the federal government level? I cannot and will not support legislation which would impose California's flawed fiscal system on the federal government. I urge my colleagues to learn from history, from a real-life example, my home state of California, and reject this crushing and foolish amendment. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds to respond to the gentlewoman to say that 49 out of 50 states have a balanced budget requirement, and while she cites California as perhaps the worst example, and it may be the worst example, still the fiscal situation of California is much better than the fiscal situation here in Washington. The $25 billion deficit that they have to deal with this year, and they have to deal with it, for a state that has 1/8 the population of the country of America, which taken nationwide would mean a $200 billion deficit nationwide. We have a $1.3 trillion deficit, more than 6 times as much, and this is a good discipline. It's worked in the states. It will work here as well. It's now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Flake, a member of the Appropriations Committee.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I doubt that I can match the volume that's been displayed today, usually in partisan accusations as to who's responsible for the budget mess that we're in. But I think that all of us, we Republicans, for example, in our candid moments, would admit that we were headed toward this fiscal cliff long before the current president took the wheel. But we're in this together. It's been decisions made by Republicans and Democrats to expand entitlement programs and to expand discretionary spending that have put us in the situation we're in today. I think we would also concede that any bout of fiscal discipline we've had over the past couple of decades has been caused by, or at least accompanied by, statutory spending caps that have been put in place. The problem is those only last for a few years, and then this body simply waives them. So we need a backstop. We need a constitutional backstop that will force us to make decisions that we know have to be made. It is sad commentary on this body that we have to have a constitutional budget amendment to force us to do our jobs of prioritizing spending. But I think with a $15 trillion deficit, we can concede that we need it. So this won't make the decisions for us. We'll still have to make the tough decisions going ahead. But we need it nonetheless. And I urge adoption of this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Speaker, how much time do we both have now?
The gentleman from New York has 29 minutes. The gentleman from Texas has, or Virginia has 31.5 minutes.
We'll reserve once more.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce, a member of the Financial Services Committee.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the gentleman from Virginia for bringing this forward to us. The American debt was downgraded about 2 months ago. That is, we're approaching junk bond status in the minds of certain debt raters. It's not just that we have the $15 trillion debt. That's significant. But we have no apparent means or way of paying it off. Our deficit, that is, the shortfall this year, is $1.5 trillion, which will be added to that 15 during the course of spending the money. So it's not just that we're in debt, it's that we're broke. And also the raters have seen that we have gone to Social Security. Both parties for the past 70 years have taken every cent out of the Social Security lockbox and spent it. So it's not just that we're in debt $15 trillion, it's that we have taken everything out of the piggy bank and we spent that. And to my friends who are saying, we can continue to borrow money, that's also very inaccurate. We could borrow money when we ran deficits of $300 billion. That was the amount that we ran during the last year of President Bush. $300 billion, we can borrow that in the world. But when we went to the trillion-dollar deficits under President Obama, there is no nation in the world capable of lending $1 trillion. China cannot lend $1 trillion. Their total economy is $6 trillion, and so the raters looking at our economy say not only are they broke, but they have no apparent way to pay it back. It's time to say that to the American people. So this resolution is very simple. It simply says that Washington is going to do what you do as the American family. In order to pay off your bills, you tighten your belt, you live within your means. That's what we're suggesting with this balanced budget amendment, that we live within our means, that we do not spend money that we don't have. H.J.Res 2 is a common-sense solution to a serious problem that America faces. I'll support it and urge support and yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey.
Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized for 4 minutes.
The Republicans called this bill a balanced budget amendment. But it is not balanced because it will blow a hole in the budget of vital programs that millions of Americans depend on. It's unbalanced, unneeded, and will undermine our struggling economy. The Republicans want us to mangle the Constitution because they cannot manage this institution. This amendment is a means to an end. It's a means for Republicans to end Medicare, to end Social Security and Medicaid, to end every anti-poverty program. And why? Because they harbor an ancient animosity towards all of those programs, and their plan is to leave them as debt-soaked relics of an era where we actually cared about poor people, the elderly in our country. Because the Republican plan will cut critical health care and anti-poverty programs, put them on a starvation diet, and leave vulnerable Americans with the crumbs. Our economy now has a 9% unemployment rate. You know what that means? 46 million Americans today live in poverty. Do you want to know what poverty is in America in 2011? That's a family of 4 living on $22,000 a year. There are 9 million families living in that poverty. 15.9 million children live in poverty today. That's 1 in 5 children in our country living in poverty. Those are the programs that they want to cut here today for the poorest children in America in 2011. There are almost 50 million Americans at risk of not having enough food, 16 million children in danger of not going to bed tonight with a meal. 1 in 6 seniors now live in poverty, dependent upon Medicare, dependent upon Medicaid. Each of them now at grave risk because of their plan here today. Their plan is really a Robin Hood in reverse. Take from the neediest and give to the greediest. That is the plan. Now let's go back into the Wayback Machine, all the way back to the year 2000, the last time we voted on a balanced budget here in Congress. 2000. Bill Clinton was president. It passed. The budget balanced. And the country was feeling good. The economy was booming. And then George Bush takes over January of 2001. The Republicans control the House. The Republicans control the Senate. What do? Huge tax breaks for billionaires and millionaires. 2 wars which were not paid for, Iraq and Afghanistan, all on the Republicans' shoulders. And they then turned a blind eye as Wall Street turned the entire economy into a casino, which then cascaded into the biggest long-standing recession that we've seen since the Great Depression, descending upon the shoulders of who? The poor, the sick, the elderly, the ordinary families killing themselves to pay for their mortgages each day. You don't need a constitutional amendment, ladies and gentlemen, Republicans, my good friends. You have a super committee meeting right now down the corridor You know what you should do? Say, take away those $40 billion worth of tax breaks for the oil companies. They don't need them. Take away the $700 billion in new nuclear weapons programs. We don't have any targets for those nuclear weapons. Kill those programs. Look at the tax breaks for the billionaires and millionaires. They don't need them. Cut them right now. All of you have taken a pledge. No reductions in the tax breaks for billionaires. No reductions in defense spending. You've tied your own hands even as you, with crocodile tears, come out here and say how much you care about balancing the budget, how much you care about the American economy. The proof will come next week when you do not stand up in order to take the tough actions needed right now for the American economy.
The time has expired. The Chair would remind members of the body to address their comments to the Chair and not to other members of the floor. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute to address the Chair, but in response to the comments of the gentleman from Massachusetts. We do need to look at that way-back machine. I hear the gentleman's complaints about decisions made by Republicans. In the last 50 years, and the gentleman has been here for many of those years, in the last 50 years, this Congress has balanced its budget a mere 6 times. 13 of those years, Republicans were in control of the House, and 4 of those years, we had balanced budgets, including the year the gentleman mentioned. And in that year, the gentleman voted no on the balanced budget that was passed by this Congress that year. And then the year before that, we had a balanced budget. The gentleman voted no. And the year before that, had a balanced budget. And then in 1998, we had a balanced budget. And the gentleman voted no every single time that a balanced budget was offered in this Congress. And in fact, for the 37 years that Democrats controlled the Congress in the last 50 years, only twice did they do it. Now, I have to agree with the gentleman about something, and that is that Social Security and I'll give myself an additional 30 seconds to say that Social Security and Medicare are endangered. You know why they're endangered? Because we have a $15 trillion debt. And in all those years that we didn't balance the budget, what did the Congress do? They went into the Social Security Trust Fund and took every penny of it and spent it on something else. And how ironic will it be that all that debt that we're transferring to the next generation, all of that debt will be on our children and grandchildren, and when they need Social Security and Medicare, it won't be there for them, not because of anything in a balanced budget amendment, but because of the debt that we have accumulated. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Social Security and Medicare will be there unless we pass this balanced budget amendment, because this balanced budget amendment will cause the inability to pay for them. The trust fund is amply funded right now for Social Security. I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm prepared to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, who is a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and my constituents have a very simple question for people participating in this debate today. What part of broke don't you understand? What part of the fact that we are borrowing 42 cents of every dollar don't you get? You know what happens to the everyday American if they borrow 42 cents of every dollar? At time after time after time, it's bankruptcy. They lose their homes. They lose their ability to provide food for their families. They go broke, just like this country is going broke today. Only Congress doesn't have to pay an overdraft fee. When we write more money, checks for more money than we have, we're not paying an overdraft fee. You know what we're paying? We're paying interest. We're passing the buck. We're putting our future into great debt that they cannot sustain for current day spending. We shouldn't be passing the buck. We should pass the BBA, the Balanced Budget Amendment. I come from the state of Colorado, served in the Colorado State Legislature, where we have a strong balanced budget amendment. And you know what that forces us to do? It forces us to make tough choices, to make the right decisions for the people of Colorado, to make sure that we are indeed balancing our budget. Sure, it means that there are some very difficult decisions that have to be made. But that's exactly what we were sent here to do. We weren't sent here to fiddle while the Treasury burns. We were sent here to solve one of the greatest challenges that this country faces, and that is growing and insurmountable debt and deficits. I would urge my colleagues to pass this resolution. This Congress cannot make choices on its own. We need the guidance of a balanced budget amendment to restrain the unrestrained fiscal mess that we have right now. In 1995, when we passed the balanced budget amendment, the debt's grown $9 trillion since then. Our experience in Colorado and the 49 states that have a balanced budget amendment shows that when we have a requirement forcing us to balance the budgets, we will do just that. Don't pass the buck. Pass the BBA.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized. Gentleman from New York.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I now yield the gentleman from Pennsylvania 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, since it's the Thanksgiving season, maybe rather than denigrating the inheritance of a child born in our country, we could celebrate it. The truth is not that as a young American you're born with all this debt. What you're born is as a citizen of the greatest country anywhere in the world, the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world, made off of decisions that are being decried here. We could not balance our budget and win World War I or World War II, or build 40,000 miles of federal highway, or build the land-grant college system. In my church, we borrowed a mortgage to build a church, and you pay for it over time. These 49 states that we hear, these imaginary balanced budget amendments, all of those states borrow money. They have a capital budget. They borrow money to build bridges and highways and roads. This nonsense that families don't borrow money to buy homes or cars. Republicans in the majority can do better than this. This is not a debate between Democrats and Republicans. We don't need a balanced budget. We need a budget as a country that retains our leadership position in the world. We don't want to have a balanced budget and a weak military. We don't want to have a balanced budget but not be able to take care of the needs that have propelled our country forward. We just honored John Glenn and Neil Armstrong, astronauts who led our way into space. We didn't do that on a balanced budget. We said we were going to lead in terms of the race to the moon, and we led. This country deserves better. And the Republicans who are here, let us address the real issue. The real issue is that we have a 70-year low in the amount of resources coming into the government because we've cut taxes. Gentleman says, well, where can we borrow $1 trillion from? Well, we could borrow from the $1 trillion of tax expenditures we're going to provide this tax year, many to the wealthiest people in our country. We have the ability to pay our bills. We need to make the decision to do it and leave the Constitution alone.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Kingston, who is the chairman of the Agricultural Appropriations Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Goodlatte, amending the United States Constitution should never be taken lightly. It is a sacred and profound document. But 15 years ago, when Mr. Goodlatte and I and a number of others first came to town, we voted to amend that Constitution. We were joined not only by all the Republicans, but by 72 Democrats. Now some of those very 72 who voted yes have changed their mind. We're hearing the same old arguments, Social Security and Medicare. When all else goes wrong in Democrat liberal land, you start scaring seniors, children, teachers, first responders, critical programs, and saying whatever the bill is, this bill threatens them. Well, the worst thing you could do to Social Security and Medicare is to go broke. And since that vote 15 years ago, when it failed in the Senate by one single member, we have accumulated $9.2 trillion in debt. Balancing the budget is what 49 states do, what every city does, what businesses and families do. It's a matter of survival. It's not a radical concept. Oh, don't the people in Greece wish that they had a balanced budget all those many years? And what of their Social Security and Medicare programs right now? What will happen to the seniors in Greece without those critical programs if their government had done the prudent thing, the right thing, just as we tried to do 15 years ago? What a different picture it would be in Greece. But you know, Greece is not alone in trying to defy the laws of financial gravity. America seems to be doing it. For every dollar we spend, 40 cents is borrowed, and yet we are choosing to ignore all the many red flags that are around us. But when the whole thing goes broke and melts down, won't our children say, "What were you thinking?" You know, Mr. Speaker, this vote today is not about the next election. It is truly about the next generation. Vote yes.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore.
Gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
And thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.J.Res 2, the so-called balanced budget amendment. And I also rise, Mr. Speaker, to point out the nefarious, cynical, intergenerational warfare that has been raised as an argument for passing this misguided so-called balanced budget amendment. To say that we want to extract $2 trillion over the next decade from programs that benefit seniors like Social Security and Medicare and say we're doing it to keep from imposing a burden on our children and grandchildren, as if this balanced budget amendment benefited those children. Mr. Speaker, this program will devastate public education. It will devastate the federal government's current mandatory spending and Pell Grants, a program that's designed to help us meet the global challenges of the future by educating our assets, our children. It's a program that in the next decade will take $500 billion out of the Children's Health Insurance Program. It's a program that will exacerbate the hunger that children face right now through WIC and our SNAP program, our food stamp program, the Earned Income Tax Credits. We have now 1 in 5 children today that are going to bed hungry. So when we say we want to balance the budget, we are balancing them on the backs of our children. And those children that we are trying to prevent, or we say that we are trying to save, must be the children of those heirs, those 1% that we are now enriching. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would reluctantly yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schilling, a member of the Agriculture Committee.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Goodlatte for giving me the time today. You know, we continue to hear a common thread. Let's raise taxes on our job creators with no solution to our spending problems. I rise today as the People's House prepares to vote for an amendment to our Constitution that would require Congress and the President to balance the budget. I look forward to voting in favor of this amendment today. 15 years ago, an amendment nearly identical to this one passed the House with strong bipartisan support, but failed by 1 single vote in the Senate. Since that time, our debt has tripled. Did you know that on Wednesday, our national debt surpassed $15 trillion? And it has been nearly 950 days since the Senate has passed the budget, not to mention the 20 jobs that are sitting over there that they've decided not to act upon. The American people deserve better. You deserve a credible plan to help get our fiscal house in order, grow our economy, and get folks back to work. It's clear, though, we cannot borrow or spend our way out of this mess. We also cannot afford to put off badly needed but difficult decisions. We need to tackle this unsustainable spending addiction head on. Since coming to Washington, my fellow freshman colleagues and I have helped change the way the conversation has been held here for years, from how much can we spend to how much can we save. This is a good start, but we can do much more to get our country on a better fiscal path and save the American dream for our kids and our grandkids. We have the duty to leave our kids and our grandkids with a country better off than it is now. We have the opportunity here to fundamentally change the way Washington does business by supporting a balanced budget amendment. It's time for Washington to balance the budget. I'm pleased to vote in strong support of a balanced budget amendment, and will continue working on ways to get our fiscal house in order, grow America's economy, and create jobs. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to H.J.Res 2. It represents an attack on the middle class and the most vulnerable in our society by the Grover Norquist Tea Party Republicans. You see, there is no fiscal emergency, but the fiscal crisis has been manufactured by the Tea Partiers, along with Grover Norquist and the Republicans that represent them, for the purposes of tricking the American people into thinking that America can't pay its bills. We paid our debts. We can pay our debts, and we'll continue to pay our debts. Just like families of America who incur debt as a normal course of taking care of their families. We've heard a lot of analogies to the federal government should balance its budget like a family. But how many 99ers, how many families do you know that can go out and purchase a car for cash? How many of those 99ers, how many of those families out there working can afford to pay for a house cash? Everybody out there incurs debt for legitimate expenses, and this nation has legitimate expenses that it has to pay debts for, like 2 wars, like a Medicare Part D supplement, like the Bush tax cuts that they don't want to expire. So what they're doing, ladies and gentlemen, is they are trying to enshrine in the Constitution what is already an unfair tax system, a system that favors the rich and balances the budget on the backs of the middle class. Those are the people that pay for America's expenses, not the corporations and wealthy individuals, many of whom do not pay 1 red cent in taxes, and you know it's true, and they know it's true. So, ladies and gentlemen, I rise in strong opposition. This is short-sighted, mean-spirited, unfair, wrong for America, and I urge my colleagues to vote against it.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Walsh, chairman of the Small Business Economic Growth Subcommittee.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a big thank you to the gentleman from Virginia for taking a lead, a very strong lead on this issue. Mr. Speaker, like many of my fellow freshmen, I was sent here to Washington because we're broke. We have a government we can't afford. Like all of us, we were sent here, though, not just to cut spending. We were sent here, hopefully, to try to change the way this town does business so that we never get to this point again, so that our kids and our grandkids aren't stuck with a bill they'll never be able to pay off. As a freshman in Congress, the very first bill I introduced back in March was a balanced budget amendment, and it was a stronger balanced budget amendment than this. It included a spending limitation. It made it more difficult for myself and my colleagues to raise taxes. I support this balanced budget amendment with everything I've got because, again, we have an opportunity to do something fairly historic. And this amendment will enable us to do that. You know, I've learned in my year, almost a year as a congressman, that there's plenty of hypocrisy in this chamber on both sides of the aisle. The hypocrisy today is, regrettably, Mr. Speaker, with too many of our Democratic colleagues who really would like to vote for this, but they simply can't because of political reasons. And I would ask them, I would implore my Democratic colleagues to just think about, again, what our kids and our grandkids will say, and we throw their names around here often, what they will say to us 20, 30, 40 years down the road when they know we didn't exhibit the courage we need to exhibit right here and now. So I stand with my colleague from Virginia in full support of this balanced budget amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank my friend from New York, and I rise in strong opposition to this piece of legislation. You know, with all due respect, I always enjoy listening to my Republican friends lecture us about fiscal responsibility. May I remind them that when Bill Clinton left office, we had record surpluses, and in 8 years of George Bush, record deficits. And may I remind my Republican friends that for 6 of those 8 years, during the Bush years, Republicans controlled both houses of the Congress. So if we were going to do the right thing and attempt to balance our budget, we could have done so then. But what did we do then? We fought 2 wars on a credit card. We had tax cuts for the wealthy, which we're now paying for in terms of our deficits now, a prescription drug program unpaid for. And so it seems to me that if we have the resolve to do it, you know, I love people who have newfound religion, but when they controlled the place, we went from massive surpluses to massive deficits. Now, this Congress needs to work with the President in passing a jobs bill. This Congress should be passing a robust transportation bill. This Congress should get out of the business of attacking our labor, attacking seniors, attacking women, and do what the American people want us to do, put people back to work. A balanced budget amendment will ultimately lead to either draconian cuts in the social safety net for some of our nation's most cherished programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, or significant tax hikes on the nation's middle class. This is nothing more than a gimmick to garner headlines while avoiding the tough decisions that the people have asked us to make. You know, there may be times in the future when we need to run a surplus. There may be times when we need to run a deficit to stimulate the economy. This amendment handcuffs us and puts us in a straitjacket where we have nowhere to move. I care, and my constituents care very much about preserving Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. I think that if we're going to get our budget to balance, it's not only cuts in programs that we need, although my friends on the other side of the aisle fret about defense cuts. We need to cut spending, yes. We also need to raise taxes on those who can most afford to do it, the 1%. I think that's something we should consider. So while we think this is one size fits all, and we can all go home and say, well, we tried to save the Republic, what I think this does is handcuff us for generations to come, makes it impossible for us to stimulate the economy, and makes it impossible for us to continue those social service programs that the American people have come to rely on, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. I think we need to meet in the sensible center, not have something like this that's draconian. Let me finally say, what's truly absurd is that we require only a simple majority to send our men and women in uniform into harm's way, and yet the Republican majority would require a supermajority to raise the nation's debt ceiling. We all saw how close our economy came to disaster with only a simple majority vote to raise the debt ceiling the last time. So I would say to my colleagues, vote no. Let's do a job that we were elected to do. Let's make the tough choices. We don't need a balanced budget amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute to respond to my good friend from New York. I would just say to the gentleman that we do need to do the job, but you don't have to look ahead to wonder what's going to happen. All you have to do is look back. Over the last 50 years, we've balanced the budget just 6 times, and we've run up a $15 trillion national debt. Now, the gentleman has cited some criticism of Republican votes, but there are plenty of Democratic votes. In the 4 years that the Democrats were in control of this Congress just recently, we added $4 trillion to the national debt. Now, the fact of the matter is, over the 50 years, 37 of those years, Democrats have controlled the House of Representatives, and only 2 of those 37 years was it balanced. So when the gentleman says that some years will run surpluses and some years will run deficits, that's very true, but the history has been almost all those years will run deficits unless we have a discipline in our Constitution to require that we do otherwise. And I would also point out that in the 4 years since the gentleman has been here and I've been here that we've had balanced budgets, the gentleman, for I'm sure reasons that he felt were very justified, voted against all 4 of the budgets that balanced in this Congress. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. To reply to what the gentleman just said, the fact is the reason this country is in such deficit is because of a deliberate Republican crusade over the last 30 years to reduce taxes on the rich in order deliberately to create huge deficits and to then use those deficits as the excuse to justify large cuts to gut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and education programs that they have never liked in the first place, but could not justify cutting without it. We used to tax. Taxes used to be 18 to 19% of the economy, of GDP. Now they are about 14% of GDP, and yet the Republicans won't increase it because we've decreased the taxes on the rich and on the top corporations. The country's not broke. We're just not taxing the millionaires and the billionaires the way we used to. And the fact is, you look at the history here. When Ronald Reagan took over as President of the United States, the entire national debt of the United States accumulated from George Washington through Jimmy Carter was less than $800 billion. Then you had 12 years of Reagan and the first Bush cutting taxes on the rich, and when Clinton took over, you had a $4.3 trillion deficit, and it was expected to go much higher. We made the tough decisions. We voted for increased taxes in 1993 and for cutting the budget. And when Clinton left office 8 years later, the budget had been balanced. Well, from the time we made that vote in 1993, the deficit decreased every year till it became a surplus. Then it increased every year. And when Bush II took over, we were looking at a $5.7 trillion surplus over the next 10 years, and we were going to pay off the entire national debt. Then we had those huge Bush tax cuts and the irresponsible unpaid-for wars, and when Bush left office, we had a $9.5 trillion deficit, a turnaround of $15 trillion, and the recession, which causes the bigger deficits now. When the CBO gave I'll give myself an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
When the CBO estimated before President Obama took office, it said that the next year's deficit would be $1.2 trillion before he did anything. And I would remind us that the non-defense discretionary spending in this country has not gone up by a nickel, adjusted for inflation and population growth, since 2001, when we had a huge surplus. The problem is that our taxes on the rich are too low. We cannot reach an agreement in the super committee because the Republicans will not tax the rich. And that's the basic problem, and a balanced budget amendment will not solve that problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back and reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll give myself a minute to respond to the gentleman.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, let me just be very clear that when the gentleman talks about the sins that he wants to impose upon Republicans for not balancing the budget, I think that's a very good argument. But since this is a bipartisan bill and dozens of his colleagues will be voting for this, I think it's because those of us who vote for it recognize that this is true on both sides of the aisle, that there has been a lack of tough decisions that have led to balanced budgets. Every single year I vote for the toughest budget offered in this Congress. Those budgets never pass. Why? Because there's no requirement that they do so. So what do we have? We have complaints on the other side of the aisle that this is a terrible plot on our part to bring about all kinds of harsh cuts. This balanced budget amendment doesn't make any distinction between whether you balance the budget by raising taxes or cutting spending. I'm going to do it to cut spending because I see lots of waste in our government, and I voted for budgets that bring about a balance without raising taxes. But that is not the point here. The point is that it doesn't get done either way. I yield myself an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
Now, as to the gentleman's complaint that this is all because we haven't taxed the rich, my goodness, in the last Congress, under the control of your party, you extended all of those tax cuts for everyone. Everyone. And the fact of the matter is that the top 1% of American families pay 38% of the personal income taxes in this country today. So, and that, by the way, is up from 34% in 2001. So all of this can be on the table when we have a discussion about how to balance the budget. All we're debating here today is the principle of whether or not we should balance the budget and looking at the past history where we have not indeed balanced it, but 6 times in 50 years. Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. West, who is not only a member of the House Armed Services Committee, but a great advocate for fiscal responsibility and the balanced budget.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Virginia, and I want to say that I rise in strong support of H.J.Res 2, which is the Balanced Budget Amendment. The United States of America has just topped $15 trillion in debt. $4.4 trillion of new debt has been added. In Greece, we see a debt-to-GDP ratio of 128%. Mr. Speaker, in Italy, it's 120% debt-to-GDP ratio. The United States of America is now at 101% debt-to-GDP ratio. It is about time now that we start to make a decision. Are we going to be fiscally disciplined? Are we going to have fiscal responsibility? Are we going to continue to bankrupt the future of our children and grandchildren because we were sent here to be elected officials, sent here to be leaders, and we're afraid to make the tough decisions? Historically, we have shown that we are not going to make those tough decisions. Now, I've only been here for 11 months. But I will tell you that right now, we have to do something different. And it has to start now, or else what do I say, Mr. Speaker, to my 2 daughters, 18 and 14? Am I going to say to them that I did not have the courage to stand here today and to make the right decisions in order to ensure that they have a bright and prosperous future in the United States of America? It is not about raising taxes. In fiscal year 2011, we saw a 6.5% increase in revenues in the United States of America, yet we still had a $1.3 trillion deficit, which follows on the heels of a $1.42 and a $1.29 trillion deficit. Now is the time for a balanced budget amendment. If not now, then when? When we hit $20 trillion in debt? Mr. Speaker, I think that each and every one of us here today, when we cast our vote, there needs to be that little yellow Y next to our names. Because if it's a red N next to our names, we're telling the American people that we're not willing to stand up and make the hard decisions. We're not willing to make ourselves fiscally responsible. And I think that's absolutely reprehensible. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would note that the gentleman from Virginia has 15.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from New York has 13 minutes remaining. The chair would recognize the gentleman from New York.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, a member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee and a great supporter of a balanced budget amendment.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I am indeed a great supporter of the balanced budget amendment, and I stand in strong support of it today. You know, it's amazing to me we still keep talking about the Bush-era tax cuts. Those same tax cuts are today's current tax law that have been affirmed by this Congress, this Senate, and signed into law by this President. So why we keep blaming financial woes on President Bush is beyond me. But let's make one thing perfectly clear. The American people are not taxed too little. The problem is that Washington spends too much. This has been going on for years, and it needs to stop now. We need a balanced budget amendment because Washington has clearly indicated its inability to discipline itself. This balanced budget amendment offers Congress and the President a very clear choice. Either stand with the already overtaxed American families and small businesses who have to balance their budgets on a daily basis, or stand with the Washington establishment that always demands more of the American people, more of their hard-earned tax dollars without any accountability with how they spend their money. American families have to stick to a budget every month, so why should the federal government be any different? We can't keep mortgaging our children's future to China. It's time to take a stand, Mr. Speaker. The tax and spend and then blame the American people for not paying their, quote, fair share game must end, and it can end today. Passing the balanced budget amendment will help bring this country back to economic prosperity and end this game. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois for unanimous consent statement.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter of national organizations opposing the balanced budget amendment. They include the Children Welfare League of America, the Children's Defense Fund, the Children Dental Health Project, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, Division of Early Childhood of the Council for Exceptional Children, the Easter Seals, Every Child Matters Education Fund, Families USA, the Forum for Youth Investment, the Foster Family-Based Treatment Association, Horizons for Homeless Children, the National Association for Adults with Special Learning Needs, the National Association for Education of Young Children, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, the National Association of Private Special Education Centers, the National Association of School Psychologists, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, the National Black Child Development Institute, the National Partnership for Women and Families, the National School Boards Association, School Social Work Association of America, Youth Build USA, the YWCA, the AIDS Alliance for Children, Youth, and Families, the Alliance for Educational Excellence, the Association of Education Service Agencies. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker.
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield the gentleman from Illinois 4 minutes.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like my good friend from Virginia, the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee, to engage me in a dialogue on a series of questions. The most important question to be raised with respect to the BBA, at least for me, and I believe most Americans, is how does the balanced budget amendment narrow certain gaps that are obvious in our society? The first gap, Mr. Chairman, is the social gap between racial minorities and the majority population. How does the balanced budget amendment narrow that gap?
Well, the balanced budget amendment is fair to all because all it simply says is that for all time, the people of this country want their government to live within their means, not just right now, but in the future as well. Right now, we're not anywhere near living within our means. $1.3 trillion deficits each of the last 3 years.
Respectfully, Mr.
All
Chairman.
that's being passed on to those children.
Respectfully, Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time, it does not reduce the gap between racial minorities and the majority population. My next question. There's a gender gap in our society. Women earn 76 cents to the dollar of what men earn in our society. How does the balanced budget amendment close the gap between what women earn in our society and what men earn in our society?
If you don't balance the budget and you continue to pile up enormous debt, women, children, minorities, all will suffer in the future because our economy will shrink, just like Greece's economy is shrinking right now because they can't meet their obligations. And to answer the gentleman's question, I think it's best to turn to those people themselves.
Respectfully, Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time. The balanced budget amendment does not close the gap between women who earn 76 cents to the dollar of what men make, because only the federal government in the 50 states can close the gap between what women earn in our society and what men earn in our society. How does the balanced budget amendment close the economic gap between the rich and the poor in our society? I'd be happy to yield to my friend from Virginia.
Sure. Well, I just pointed out that the rich pay far, far, far more in taxes than other people do, and they should. But this balanced budget amendment doesn't make any distinction between how you balance it, whether it's by increasing revenues, whether it's by economic growth, or whether it's by tax increases.
Reclaiming my time. The failure of this balanced budget amendment to not make any distinction between the rich and the poor is part of the fallacy and the problem with the balanced budget amendment. We are here as representatives of the people to close profound gaps that exist between our constituents and the society. We're supposed to be one America. We're supposed to be all Americans. We're supposed to be one people, e pluribus unum, though many, one, going somewhere. But what I'm hearing from the distinguished chairman is that the gaps will not close.
The gentleman yields.
I'd be happy to yield to the chairman.
I'm not the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Congressman Smith of Texas is, but I am
happy to yield to the gentleman controlling the time for the majority. Thank you, Mr. Majority Controller of the time. Infrastructure gaps. Upgrades to roads, in communities that have been left behind, bridges, ports, levees, waters, and sewer systems. How does the balanced budget amendment propose to close the infrastructure gaps that exist in our society where the states themselves have failed to do so?
If you don't have the resources to pay for what you need because you've spent it on a lot of other things,
Reclaiming
you're
my
not
time.
going to have the infrastructure.
Reclaiming my time. I must assume then that there is no goal of the balanced budget amendment to actually close the infrastructure
Would the gentleman
gaps.
yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Absolutely there's a goal of doing that, and it is the goal of being able to generate a growing economy that results from living within your means and then using those means to pay for the things that our society needs.
Reclaiming my time. It is obvious that the balanced budget amendment does not narrow the economic, social, gender, and generational gaps and infrastructural gaps in our country. Mr. Speaker, vote down the BBA. Give the American people a reason to believe that the federal government can close the gaps that exist within our society.
It's expired.
I'd be happy to yield back the balance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Virginia.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself a minute to say to the gentleman that the balanced budget amendment also will not deliver a pennant to the Chicago Cubs. Now, let me also say this. In talking about those groups that the gentleman is rightly concerned about, how they will do in the future, CNN asked them what they thought of a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution, and 75% of women said they favored a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. 72% of non-white voters said they favored a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. 79% of our senior citizens said they favored a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. 79% of those who earn less than $50,000 a year said they favor a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. And the same is true whether you look at urban areas, suburban areas, rural areas, or any geographic region of our country. Consistently, they support a balanced budget amendment, and I would be happy to yield.
I think that. What would the balanced budget amendment do for the Chicago White Sox? I'm a South Sider.
I don't know. I'm a Boston Red Sox fan. We finally got ours, but
I thank the gentleman.
But we have a ways to go.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, since the gentleman has admitted that the balanced budget amendment would not deliver the pennant to the White Sox or the Red Sox or the Cubs or, I suppose, the Yankees, there's no argument for the balanced budget amendment. I'll reserve it this time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, who is the Chief Deputy Whip and a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Roscom.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time, 2 minutes. The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. You know, there's a level of anxiety that we're all sensing back at home as people are looking at Washington, D.C. for solutions, and there's various tales that are going on right now in terms of what the Joint Select Committee is going to be able to produce. And the fact of the matter is we don't know what the yield is going to be of that negotiation. That's still ongoing, and we'll be dealing with that next week. But we know what we can do right now, Madam Speaker. We can create a buoyancy and a sense of clarity and a sense of cohesiveness to seize upon a bipartisan moment. A moment that the country came close to in 1995. It came within a whisker of passing the balanced budget amendment and sending it out to the states. Over 70 House Democrats in 1995, including several of the current leaders, voted in favor of that amendment. And now here we are, and we have that opportunity to do the same thing, although to do it successfully. This is not about donkeys and elephants. This is ultimately about us coming together as a Congress in a thoughtful way that says one thing to the United States, and that is we can govern wisely, we can govern forthrightly, we can live within our means, and we can do what the overwhelming majority, Madam Speaker, of the American public wants to do, and that is to balance our budget. I urge both sides of the aisle to shrug off the bad advice, frankly, of the Democratic leadership and to come down here in a short period of time and vote aye. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York.
I reserve at this point.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Virginia for yielding.
You know, I had the privilege for 6 years to serve as a county commissioner in Ohio and 11 years to serve in the General Assembly. And during that time, we saw good times, we saw bad times in the economy. But in the bad times, our Constitution told us in the state of Ohio that we had to balance our books to make sure that we didn't overspend. And that's what this House has to do and this country has to do. You know, when you look back, we don't have a very good track record for over 50 years and only saying we were balanced for 6 times during that period of time. That's horrendous. You know, it's kind of interesting because I was at a town hall and I was talking one day and one of my farmers came up and asked this question. He said, I don't understand what the problem is in Washington. He said, what's the president want to spend? And I told him, it's about $3.8 trillion. He said, how much do you got? And I told him what we thought the revenue was going to be for the year. He said, well, it's simple. All you got to do is subtract your revenues from what you think what you want to spend, and that's all you get to spend is just that revenue. You don't spend over the top of it. People back home understand it, because people back home sit around their kitchen tables, their dining room tables, and they get their pencils and papers out, and they figure out how much they can spend. It's not complicated, but we've got to start thinking about this because we're in debt now $15 trillion, and it went over this week, $15 trillion. When I have to look at my kids' faces and kids down the street, and when I go into schools and talk to these young children, they're going to ask me in 10, 15 years, what did you do to us, not for us? And it's time that this Congress acts and passes this balanced budget amendment. We've been talking about it for years, and we have that opportunity today, and I thank the gentleman for bringing it forth, and I can't tell you that I wish I could vote for it more than once today. But we must pass this today, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.